I was carrying furniture into my new house when police sirens surrounded me. "Step away and put your hands up," they shouted. My HOA president neighbor Karen had called cops, convinced I was robbing the place. Little did she know, I was moving into my own home that I just bought. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. The police sirens started wailing just as I was carrying my grandfather's antique oak dresser up the front steps of 1247 Maple Drive. I set the heavy piece down on the porch and looked around, wondering what emergency had brought 3 squad cars racing down my quiet suburban street. That's when I realized the sirens were stopping. Right in front of my house. "Sir, step away from the furniture and put your hands where I can see them." I turned to see Officer Martinez approaching with his hand resting on his service weapon, while 2 other officers flanked me from either side. Behind them, standing in her perfectly manicured front yard like some kind of neighborhood watch commander, was a woman I'd never seen before, middle-aged, blonde, wearing a pink jogging suit and the most self-satisfied smirk I'd ever witnessed. "Officers, there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding," I said, slowly raising my hands. "This is my house. I'm moving in." "That's exactly what I'd expect a thief to say," the blonde woman called out. "I saw him breaking in through the back door an hour ago, and now he's stealing everything that isn't nailed down." Officer Martinez looked between me and the woman, then back at me. "Sir, do you have identification and proof that you live here?" "Of course I do." I reached slowly for my wallet, acutely aware that 3 armed police officers were watching my every move. "My driver's license shows this address, and I have the deed and closing paperwork in my truck." The blonde woman, who I was beginning to suspect was the neighborhood's self-appointed security chief, marched over to join our little group. "Officers, I'm Margaret Williamson, HOA president for Sunset Hills. I've lived across the street for 8 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this man does not belong here." "Ma'am, we appreciate your vigilance," Officer Martinez said diplomatically, "but we need to verify the facts before we take any action." I handed over my driver's license, which clearly showed my name, David Chin, and the address 1247 Maple Drive. Officer Martinez examined it carefully, then looked at the house number to confirm the match. "Mr. Chin, you said you have additional documentation?" "Absolutely. Everything's in my truck." I gestured toward the U-Haul truck parked in the driveway, which was still half full of boxes and furniture. "I closed on this house yesterday morning." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. The Hendersons have lived here for 15 years. I know because I organized their welcome party when they moved in." Officer Martinez was starting to look like a man who realized he'd been called to mediate a dispute rather than arrest a burglar. "Ma'am, when was the last time you actually saw the Hendersons?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. A confused expression crossed her face. "Well, they've been traveling a lot lately. But their cars have been in the driveway and—" "Mrs. Williamson," I said as gently as I could manage, "the Hendersons moved to Florida 6 months ago. They put the house on the market in January and I bought it last week." "That's absolutely impossible. I would have known if they were selling. As HOA president, I have to approve all sales to ensure new residents meet our community standards." Officer Martinez looked at me with what might have been sympathy. "Mr. Chin, let's take a look at that paperwork." I led the officers to my truck, acutely aware that Margaret was following close behind, muttering about suspicious circumstances and inadequate background checks. From the truck's cab, I retrieved a folder containing my closing documents, the deed, my mortgage paperwork, and the settlement statement. Officer Martinez reviewed everything carefully while his colleagues examined my driver's license and the house numbers. After about 10 minutes, he handed everything back to me. "Mr. Chin, everything appears to be in order. You clearly own this property." "This is ridiculous." Margaret exploded. "How was I supposed to know he bought the house? Nobody informed me. Nobody asked for my approval. This is a clear violation of HOA protocols." That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous neighbor. I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed she had authority over real estate transactions in the neighborhood. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with HOA disputes before, "homeowners don't need HOA approval to sell their houses. And new residents don't need permission to move into homes they've legally purchased. But what about the background check? What about the financial verification? What about the covenant compliance review?" I stared at Margaret. "Are you saying you think you have the right to approve or reject people who want to buy houses in this neighborhood?" "Of course I do. I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to maintain our community standards and property values. Officer Martinez was shaking his head. Ma'am, that's not how HOAs work. You can't prevent legal property sales. But Margaret was just getting started. Officers, I demand that you investigate this situation more thoroughly. How do we know this man's documents aren't forged? How do we know he didn't steal them from the real buyer? This whole situation is highly suspicious. At this point, I was starting to get genuinely angry. I'd been looking forward to this day for weeks. Finally moving into my first house, starting fresh after my divorce, creating a new life for myself. Instead, I was standing in my own driveway being accused of theft by a woman who apparently thought she was the neighborhood dictator. Mrs. Williamson, I said, trying to keep my voice level, I understand you're concerned about security in your neighborhood. But I am the legitimate owner of this house. I have all the proper documentation. I'm not stealing anything, I'm moving my own belongings into my own home. That's exactly what a clever thief would say. Margaret shot back. And how do I know those documents aren't fake? Anyone can print official-looking papers these days. Officer Martinez looked like he was developing a headache. Ma'am, we verified Mr. Chen's identification and reviewed his documentation. Everything is legitimate. But you haven't done a background check. You haven't verified his employment. You haven't confirmed that he meets our neighborhood's financial requirements. Mrs. Williamson, I said slowly, what exactly do you think gives you the right to require background checks and financial verification from your neighbors? I'm the HOA president. It's my job to protect this community. That's when Officer Martinez stepped in. Ma'am, I think there may be some confusion about HOA authority. Being president of a homeowners association doesn't give you any legal power over property sales or the right to demand personal information from residents. Margaret's face was turning red. That's absolutely wrong. I have full authority over all HOA matters. I decide who can live here and who can't. I was beginning to understand that Margaret had somehow convinced herself that being HOA president made her some kind of elected official with actual governmental power. The reality, that an HOA president is basically just someone who volunteers to organize neighborhood meetings and make sure people mow their lawns, didn't seem to have penetrated her consciousness. Officers, I said, I really appreciate your patience, but I'd like to continue moving into my house now. Is there anything else you need from me? Actually, Mr. Chin, there is one more thing we should verify. Officer Martinez pulled out his radio. Dispatch, can you run a property records check on 1247 Maple Drive? While we waited for the property records confirmation, Margaret continued her tirade. This is exactly the kind of thing I was warning the neighborhood about. We have procedures for a reason. We have standards for a reason. You can't just let anyone move in without proper screening. Mrs. Williamson, I said, my patience finally wearing thin, I'm not anyone. I'm a software engineer who paid $340,000 for this house. I passed a background check for my mortgage. I've been pre-approved by the bank. I have no criminal record, no outstanding debts, and no history of HOA violations. What exactly are you worried about? How do I know any of that is true? You could be a criminal. You could be a drug dealer. You could be one of those people who doesn't maintain their property values. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life. Unit 23, property records show 1247 Maple Drive was purchased by David Chin on March 15. Previous owners were Robert and Linda Henderson, who sold the property after relocating to Florida. Thank you, dispatch. Officer Martinez turned to Margaret. Ma'am, that confirms everything Mr. Chin has told us. He is the legitimate owner of this property. Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish trying to breathe air. But that's impossible. Nobody told me. I would have been notified. Ma'am, why would you be notified about a private property sale? Because I'm the HOA president. I have to approve all new residents. I could see that Officer Martinez was starting to lose his professional composure. Mrs. Williamson, let me be very clear about this. You do not have the authority to approve or reject new residents. You do not have the right to demand background checks. You do not have any legal power over property sales in this neighborhood. That's absolutely wrong. I've been president for 3 years and I've been screening all new residents. I have files on everyone. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of files? Margaret lifted her chin proudly. Financial records, employment verification, criminal background checks, credit reports, everything necessary to ensure our community standards. Officer Martinez and I exchanged glances. Ma'am, how exactly did you obtain credit reports and criminal background checks on your neighbors? I have my sources. Mrs. Williamson, obtaining someone's credit report or criminal background check without their permission is a federal crime. Margaret's confident expression faltered slightly. But I'm the HOA president. I have a right to that information. No, ma'am, you don't. While Officer Martinez was explaining the various laws Margaret had likely broken in her quest to screen the neighborhood, I was thinking about something else she'd said. Mrs. Williamson, you mentioned that you've been screening residents for 3 years. Did you screen the Hendersons when they moved in? Of course not. The Hendersons were already here when I became president. They were grandfathered in. But you said you organized their welcome party 15 years ago. Margaret's face went blank. Well, that was different. Officer Martinez was taking notes now. Ma'am, you said you organized a welcome party for the Hendersons 15 years ago, but then you said they were already here when you became president 3 years ago. Which is it? I may have misspoken about the timeline. I was starting to realize that Margaret's entire narrative was falling apart. Mrs. Williamson, have you actually been inside the Henderson house recently? Well, no, but I could see their cars in the driveway. What cars? Margaret gestured vaguely toward my driveway. The blue sedan and the... Wait, where are their cars? There are no cars, Mrs. Williamson. The house has been empty for 6 months. Officer Martinez was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a complete mental breakdown. Ma'am, when exactly was the last time you saw the Hendersons? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I'm not sure. Maybe last summer? But I assumed they were just traveling more. For 6 months. Well, yes. I suddenly understood what had happened. Margaret had been so focused on her imaginary authority as neighborhood watchdog that she'd stopped actually paying attention to what was happening in the neighborhood. She'd convinced herself that the Hendersons were still living in their house even though it had been obviously empty for months. Mrs. Williamson, Officer Martinez said gently, I think you need to reassess your understanding of your role as HOA president. But Margaret wasn't ready to give up. Fine. So maybe I was wrong about the Hendersons. That doesn't change the fact that this man moved in without proper notification, without following proper procedures. What procedures? I asked. HOA protocols? New resident orientation, covenant compliance briefing, welcome committee approval. Officer Martinez looked at me. Mr. Chin, did you receive any information about HOA requirements when you bought the house? I received a copy of the covenants from the title company, but nothing about orientation or approval processes. That's because there are no such requirements, Officer Martinez told Margaret. You can't create mandatory procedures that aren't in the original covenants. Margaret was starting to look desperate. But someone has to maintain order. Someone has to make sure our property values are protected. Someone has to screen out undesirable residents. Mrs. Williamson, I said as calmly as I could, what exactly makes you think I'm an undesirable resident? Margaret looked at me for the first time like she was actually seeing me as a person rather than an intruder. I'm Asian American, clean-cut, wearing a college t-shirt and jeans. I drive a Honda Accord. I probably look like exactly the kind of suburban professional that most HOAs would welcome with open arms. Well, you didn't follow proper procedures. What procedures? You keep mentioning procedures that don't actually exist. Officer Martinez stepped between us. I think we've established that Mr. Chin is the legitimate owner of this property and has every right to be here. Mrs. Williamson, I strongly suggest that you familiarize yourself with the actual legal authority of HOA presidents. But what about community security? What about maintaining standards? Ma'am, calling the police on a homeowner who's moving into his own house isn't community security, it's harassment. Margaret's face crumpled. For the first time since this whole absurd situation started, she looked like she might be realizing the enormity of her mistake. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I understand that, Officer Martinez said kindly. But the way to protect your neighborhood is to build relationships with your neighbors, not to have them arrested for existing. After the police left, I stood in my driveway looking at Margaret, who was still hovering uncertainly in her front yard. Part of me wanted to go inside and pretend this whole incident had never happened. But another part of me realized that if I was going to live across the street from this woman, we needed to establish some kind of functional relationship. Mrs. Williamson, I called over to her. Would you like to see my closing documents? The real ones. She walked over slowly, looking embarrassed. Mr. Chin, I owe you an apology. Yes, you do. But I'm more interested in understanding what just happened here. I showed her the deed, the settlement statement, and the mortgage documents. Margaret examined them carefully, and I could see the reality of the situation finally sinking in. I really did buy this house, I said. I really am your new neighbor. And I really was just trying to move my furniture inside when you called the police. Margaret sat down heavily on my front steps. I feel like such an idiot. Can I ask you something? Why did you think you had the authority to approve new residents? Margaret was quiet for a long time. When I became HOA president, I was so determined to make this the best neighborhood possible. I wanted to maintain property values, ensure community standards, create a safe environment for families. Those are good goals. But somewhere along the way, I think I started believing that wanting to protect the neighborhood gave me the right to control it. I sat down next to her on the steps. Margaret, can I give you some advice? She nodded. The best way to create a great neighborhood isn't to screen out people you think might cause problems. It's to welcome people and give them a reason to be good neighbors. I called the police on you for moving into your own house. Yes, you did. And that was wrong. But you know what? I'm still willing to be a good neighbor if you are. Margaret looked at me with surprise. After what I just put you through? Margaret, everyone makes mistakes. The question is what we do next. 6 months later, Margaret and I had become unlikely friends. She turned out to be a widow who'd channeled her loneliness and anxiety into an obsessive need to control her environment. Once she realized that being HOA president was about building community rather than enforcing imaginary authority, she became one of the most effective neighborhood leaders I've ever seen. She organized block parties, coordinated neighborhood watch programs that actually focused on security rather than harassment, and created a welcome committee that helped new residents understand the community without making them feel like criminals. As for me, I learned that sometimes the people who seem most unreasonable are just scared and confused. Margaret genuinely thought she was protecting her neighborhood when she called the police on me. She was wrong, but her intentions weren't malicious, they were just misguided. The day I got arrested for moving into my own house became a neighborhood legend. Margaret tells the story herself now, usually as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of actually talking to your neighbors before making assumptions about them. And every time someone new moves into Sunset Hills, Margaret makes sure they get a proper welcome, the kind that involves homemade cookies and helpful information, not background checks and police calls. Sometimes the worst neighbors can become the best neighbors, if you give them the chance to learn from their mistakes.